All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dear Dr. Fantasy. And for my very special guest today, I have here Alex from Books with Banks. And it is such a pleasure to have you here. Alex, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me on. I mentioned this a little before we started recording, but I haven't been on anyone else's channel, so I just feel so
Yeah.
honored to be a guest on your channel. And yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, wow. The honor is mine. I have been enjoying your content a lot. And you are a fellow fan of a lot of the series that I love. So this is a logical discussion. This makes a lot of sense for the two of us to get together. Speaking of which, maybe you could give everybody a sense of what you do on your channel, what kinds of books you like to cover, what are the series that you are invested in, and maybe some that you think you might be reading in the future.
Okay, yeah, sure. Thank you. As a uh, Dear Dr. Fantasy mentioned, we have a lot of stuff in common, a lot of reading interests in common, and my channel name is Books with Banks, and mostly I started my channel because I love the Malazan Book of the Fallen and the works of Stephen Erickson in the Malazan world, but also the works of Ian Esslemont in that same world. And I had just around August, I guess in August 2022, I read Fall of Light, book two of Erickson's prequels for the first time.
Yeah,
And
Arcanus trilogy. Yeah.
right. And I loved it. And I thought, oh, every page, every sentence is there's so much I could pick apart here. Let me go on to BookTube and see how much conversation has been had about this book. And I found a handful of videos that talk about the Carcanas, right, including
I have a
one
couple.
of your
Yeah.
reviews, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, and even like a lot of the videos that I found were talking about the first book in that trilogy, which I believe was published in 2012. The second one was published in 2016.
Words of
And
Darkness and Fall of Light. Yeah.
right.
Uh,
And there were more on the first one and a couple on the second. And when I say more and then a couple, it's like three or four videos on the first book and then two or three on the second one.
yeah,
So
I got one on both, so I'm
right. Right. And yeah, and so I guess I figured if this is the book that is sending me or that is making me ask the most questions out of all the Malazan stuff I've read, I
yeah,
figured I'd want to maybe add more conversation to the YouTube community kind of space about the Carcanis trilogy specifically.
awesome. Awesome.
And then I kind of also started to think maybe if Carcanis hasn't been talked about that much, the works of Ian Esslemont haven't been talked about that much either.
Yep.
So
Yep. I'm
even
also one of the few who've done
right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, and I loved all of your videos, and AP has videos where he picks apart scenes and stuff in those. A Critical Dragon, but I'm
Yeah.
guessing people
AP and
watching.
I
Yeah.
covered the novels of the Malazan Empire. I actually read the three books in Paths to Ascendancy that had been published at the time on my own before the collaborations with AP, but I've reviewed those just like I did with Forge of Darkness and Fall of Light.
Right.
So yeah, and now of course we've both read Forge of the High Mage. You had a discussion with Ian Esselstyn
Yes.
on it, so yeah, nice.
Yeah, and that was a blast. I mean, I feel bad because only like the first 10 or 15 minutes of it are really spoiler free. So for
Uh-huh.
people in like in the US who maybe are can't get their hands on the book yet, I do feel bad that only the first part of that video is really accessible.
I think
But
10 or 15 minutes of spoiler free is actually fine.
okay.
Yeah. But I mean, it's going to affect your viewing time on your video.
Right. But
That's
that's okay. Yeah. It'll age well once more people put
yes,
their hands on it,
like a
maybe.
good wine.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. Yeah.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. So yeah, you've talked to both Stephen Erickson and Ian Esslemont on your channel. Just so everybody knows, there's some
Yeah.
great discussion there with you and Mr. Erickson, and now with you and Mr. Esslemont. How's that feel?
That feels a little nerve-wracking, but in all the best ways. Not as nerve-wracking as presenting a paper at ICFA and having Stephen Erickson walk into the room when I'm going to mention one of his characters.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in the paper. But I no, he was wonderful at it.
It was in the audience listening to you deliver your paper.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Oh
you're
yeah.
you're talking about his books. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
That probably would get me a little nervous too. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I really, I guess after the fact, and from a little bit of the conversation, the first interview I did with him on my channel, I I had nothing to really be nervous about. As you know, he's such a nice
Oh,
guy.
he's so laid back and so
Yeah,
nice. Very
yeah.
kind
And I
person.
feel like he's
Yeah.
just eager to hear what people think about his work. Like he's eager to see what is jumping out to people, and what kind of
Yeah.
conversations are happening. Because yeah, and I can imagine why that would be, because there's just so much to talk about. So with any book, who's to say what the prevailing conversation is going to be over that entry?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, you're so right. I mean, when I've had the opportunity to engage with him, he's very personable and easy to talk to. But yeah, you can tell though there's a part of him that it's his author kind of thinking, wanting to know, okay, what is it about my writing that you like? And
uh,
okay, these are the scenes you talk about that hit you emotionally. Why do you think these scenes hit you emotionally? And I'm trying to explain that,
right, right.
which is a very cool conversation to have from the perspective of just the craft, and he is so much a student of the craft. That is how he got to be the my favorite writer of all time,
Okay.
just being so diligent in his examination of what makes writing work. And that just comes across in a lot of the conversations, I think.
Yeah, yeah. He's always working on his next. Like he's always taking
Yeah.
what the conversation is and applying it to, or it seems like he's applying it to what he's currently working on.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to change it on what any of us booktube people have to say, but to take
No,
that into consideration. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. No, it's valuable. It's really valuable to get feedback from readers. And even if not every reader can articulate why they feel the way they feel when they're reading a book, I think sometimes somebody like Stephen Erickson can put things together from what people like us can articulate, right?
Right.
So yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So what else? We're still on the topic of your channel. So
Oh, yeah.
Malazan obviously is a big part of your channel, but you cover other stuff too, right?
Yeah, so yeah, Malazan, and especially the kind of side series of Malazan, was definitely the main focus at first. Then I kind of started to look at what I was currently reading, second half of last year, beginning of this year,
Yeah.
and I realized I'm in the middle of reading Diana Gabaldon's Outlander series. My fiance's gotten me into Sarah J. Maas's A Court of Thorns and Roses series.
Okay.
Fantasy works that I feel like typically don't get brought up in the same kind of corners of booktube as
Yeah. I
Malazan.
I would guess that those two authors both have lots of people talking about them, but not in our corner of YouTube, I think.
Right,
Right.
right.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and I wonder if the romance aspect of those series is a big, maybe deterrent, or maybe it puts some people off of wanting to tackle those. I'm not sure.
An
And
interesting question.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, so romance is much bigger than fantasy.
right,
It dwarfs fantasy in terms of sales. So romance is not a reason why these series wouldn't be talked about on
right.
YouTube. I'm sure I haven't looked, but I would eat my shoes if you can't find channels that are talking about those two series.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Pretty confident that,
Especially A Court of Thorns and Roses. Sarah J.
yeah.
Maas is
Okay.
huge on certain in certain
But
corners.
even the Outlander series is
Yeah.
massive. I mean,
Oh,
the
yeah. Yeah.
sales I don't know what they are. They're huge, I would guess. So, but you're right that our little community that we belong to doesn't tend to do romance a whole lot.
Right. Right.
And I'm curious, and there's no reason why. I'm sure this doesn't hold up to close scrutiny, but I'm sure a lot of people think that there is a gender aspect to this,
Right. Right.
where women are more into romance and men are more into the violent epic fantasy stuff, but there are plenty of women in our community as well, and they also don't tend to talk about those series, do they?
Right, right.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I mean, there are things like with any amorous scene in fiction, you're gonna
Yeah.
come across the same innuendos and the same sort of odd eyebrow-raising descriptors that are that I can understand might make some readers cringe or say, okay, we've read this before, we know what's happening here, that
Right.
sort of thing. But then I sometimes like to turn that on its head and think about like all of the battle scenes that I've read in epic fantasy that
Yeah.
can feel fairly similar. Descriptions of blood and gore
Yeah.
sometimes use cliched terms and descriptors as well.
Once you've described one battle, it's really hard to avoid repeating yourself, I think. So, but yeah, no, it's interesting, and I'm guilty in my own writing. I have lots of epic, gory battle scenes and stuff. But I'm curious about that, and some of this is cultural. I think you and I are both American for
Right.
the United States of America, where it seems like violence is way more tolerated in our storytelling on the screen and in books and stuff than sex
Right.
in American culture. Like, we're really fine with all kinds of gore and blood and you name it. But when there's like a naked person, it's like, oh no,
Oh my goodness.
people have body parts,
Right.
It's a curious thing. And we have this odd puritanical streak, I think, that's part of it. But it's weird. It's like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde thing, I think, because yeah, we have this puritanical side of our culture where, God forbid, you talk about sex in any context, but then we have sex all over the place used to sell stuff. I mean, it's just pervasive. So it's just how do you reconcile these two things? But I think that has some bearing on this conversation about, well, why are we okay with all of the violence, but when there's a one little scene with it tends to be like this huge reaction to, oh, whoa, goodness. Especially if, now I might be wrong, people might disagree with me on this, but I have the impression that people get grossed out, are more likely to get grossed out by sex scenes if it's a male author than a female author.
Maybe, yeah, maybe. I mean, even just thinking about it now, I haven't read too many sex scenes written by a male author.
There's a reason for that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can think of a few scenes that people talk about in the context of certain, like, especially male authors, that people get grossed out by. And then I read similar kinds of scenes with throbbing members and everything else. And what's really epic fantasy with some sex scenes, like more recently, I've come across some pretty explicit scenes in Robin Hobb's writing, or in the Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. There's very explicit scenes. I've never heard anybody, maybe I'm wrong, I could be wrong, but I've never heard anybody say, oh, that's that sex scene. Whereas people reading Guy Gavriel Kay, for example,
I've heard
always seem to fixate on the sex scenes. Like, wait, is there something? I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, I'm not sure. But yeah, no, I do. I love, or I am loving the Outlander series so far.
Yeah.
And I wanted to start more conversations and do more videos about those books. So that is something I'm sort of trying to do with my channel.
Okay.
So yeah, if anyone wants to go over and check out my Outlander content, unfortunately I only have 2 or 3 videos out there. One about the series and 1 or 2 analyzing scenes from the book.
How naughty does Outlander get? Is it pretty explicit sex scenes, or is it just soft romance, or
It pretty explicit sex scenes. However, I will say for the most part, they are between like very like a very loving couple that's been together for a long time. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like even I would hesitate to say any of it's like or like cringy because these two characters have known each other for so long and have been through so much by
Yeah.
the point that you get to most of those scenes where it's kind of like, okay, well, that makes sense that they would be doing these things with each other, and whatever descriptors she uses, that's fine. She uses the word slippery a lot, which
Slippery.
slippery, yeah. Just sorry, I don't know what the audience what the age appropriate rating is for
Yeah,
the
I
video,
mean,
but
look, people can use their own imaginations there.
right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there is some stuff that's like, I don't know if I needed that word again, but I understand what's going on, but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
It's a useful word in some contexts.
It
So.
is, yeah. Oh yeah. But yeah, I watched the show first. I should
Oh,
say
okay.
that. And the show, season 7 is currently airing, but I haven't watched any of it yet because my
Yeah.
fiance and her mom and we all watch it together.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah,
Huh.
and we're kind of waiting for more episodes to be out to be able to.
Wait, you watch this with her mother present?
Yes. Yeah.
That's never like slightly awkward or anything?
I don't think so, and I think it's because her mom got her into the series saying,
Okay.
"Oh, have you gotten to episode 7 of season?" Like things like that,
Okay.
implying that certain things might transpire in episode 7 of season 1. And
Yeah.
so then Jennifer, my fiance, she watched it, and then when we actually met, Jen and I met during COVID on dating apps,
Oh, wow.
and so
Yeah.
we were just like messaging about shows and stuff that we liked. And from
Huh.
our conversations, she surmised that I might be into Outlander, and she suggested it, and I started it, and I got really hooked. And there
Ah,
were 4 or 5 seasons out then, and so I caught up to them, and now I've been watching it
well, that's
together.
great.
Yeah,
That's wonderful. That is part of your how you met and everything.
yeah.
That's really beautiful. Yeah.
So yeah, that series is going to hold a. I have more of a drive, I think, to go to that series and read it. And Jen and I were reading the books right now. I think she's not as much a fan of Diana Gabaldon's writing style as I am.
Okay.
I think it's pretty descriptive, um, uh,
Uh-huh.
or pretty like not in like gross or like weird ways,
No, no,
just
I
in
know what you
like the scene. A lot of scenes the main character gets home from something at the beginning of a chapter. She sits down in her chair and first looks around the room and thinks about how the room is decorated, and then reflects on something that's just happened before she got home. So that's kind of the slower style, the slower
I
kind of
love that. I'm
feeling.
all
Yeah.
for it. I'm a huge fan of some of the older authors who will go into more detail than a lot of modern authors seem to be willing to. So yeah, I feel like I want to be in this world. That's part of the experience. I want to feel that immersion. And the one thing that I find kind of not fun when I read some more modern fantasy is I feel like the entire story is taking place in this white space, and I
Yeah.
don't know what is this place. I don't know how to feel about it, and it just doesn't feel. There's lots of action and stuff going on, but I can't picture very well, and I guess I'm more visual in that sense, but I don't really appreciate the lack of description so much myself. But
I find myself often with a lot more modern fantasy. I'll be picturing a castle or some setting for
yeah,
2 or 3 chapters one way because I haven't gotten too many descriptors. And then
yeah.
all of a sudden in chapter 4, when the author says that room over on the left, I'm like, oh wait, that's on the left side of the house, and I have to scramble and
The
rearrange
whole scene gets reversed.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I kind of went off on a tangent there.
Oh, that's great. That's good
Yeah.
stuff. So those are other series you've covered or are covering.
Mhm.
Anything else that you want to mention that you've been reading or that you will be including in your channel? And basically, I'm hearing lots of fantasy. Are you
Yes.
going to stick to fantasy on your channel?
Yeah, so I'll stick to fantasy and sci-fi. I'll say sci-fi, but more just when I'm going back and reading classics and stuff.
Uh-huh.
There aren't really many current like modern sci-fi series that I have too much of like a hankering to go pick up. But like when great content creators like Library Ladder,
Uh-huh.
he put out a video about the Balancing book series or
Yes.
adult fantasy book series from the 60s or from the 70s. Um, and yeah, and just watching that, it was like, oh my gosh, I need to read that book. I need to read that.
Uh-huh.
And yeah,
Yeah.
and just looking back at all the old classics, and also from conversations I had with people at ICFA, I am dying to fill out my TBR more with classics and more with some just other stuff that doesn't get talked about, like foundations of the genre that don't get talked about as much on
Hmm.
here. How, I mean, that being said, I am working my way through Outlander, which is these are massive books, and I am
Uh,
reading A Court of Thorns and Roses, and so it might take me a little bit of time to get to some of those classics, but I
right.
would say in a year or so, if anyone stays in touch with my channel, I'll start putting out more videos like that. I can
Okay.
imagine. Yeah. And I
Cool.
also have some Shakespeare stuff, but that's
Oh,
kind of
nice.
yeah,
All right.
it's a whole another thing.
Nice. So you are going to wander around a bit.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Very
Yeah.
cool. Yeah. So I guess this is a good time then, now that we have a sense of what your channel is all about. Well, why did you decide to start a channel? How did you get to that point? And I guess this goes back to my standard question on Dear Dr. Fantasy, which is going on the theory that you are what you read. What are some of the formative reads in your life, going all the way back to little Alex?
All the way back.
Well,
Okay.
as far back as you want to go.
Okay. Okay. As far back as I can remember, I think like pre-kindergarten, there was one fantasy-ish book
No.
that I would read. It was one of the first books that I learned how to read. It was a picture book. It was The Polar Express, which I'm sure
Oh,
everyone
okay.
knows and
Yeah.
loves. And I probably not thought of very much as a fantasy, but it definitely has the Santa
Magical
Claus element,
elements.
right?
Yeah. They made it into a slightly creepy movie. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I wasn't, I didn't feel so great about that. Maybe that was one of my childhood moments of, ooh, maybe the book is better than the film.
I think it was just they got a little too close to the uncanny valley there.
Yeah, yeah, too much Tom Hanks CGI stuff, and
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But yeah, no, I just love that book, and I remember like learning to read the passage, like the pages and the stuff in that book, and I don't know if it's the first thing I ever learned how to read, but it really sticks with me, and that sort of ambiguous ending of, oh well, he did get the sleigh bell off Santa's sleigh, and did it happen or not?
Spoilers for Polar Express, everyone.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's really okay. That was a joke. Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's probably the earliest thing that got me really into like I I thought maybe, oh, I think I like reading, and one of the earliest things I can remember reading.
Yeah.
But then like all throughout K through 5, like the elementary school kind of age range, I remember whenever I'd go to the library, I'd check out different ones of the Magic Tree House books.
Oh yeah.
I love those. Uh, possibly influenced my interest in history,
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah. You're an
also
historian, actually.
right, yeah, I did a couple degrees in history, and now
Yeah.
I'm actually looking into maybe doing something to combine my interest of history and fantasy, a degree, but who knows where that'll go, and that's kind of that's today, but
Yeah. Yeah.
still a
That's
little
cool.
right.
Well, let
uh,
me ask you then,
yeah.
since you're an historian, how do you feel about Mr. Erickson and Esslemont's portrayals of historians in the Malazan series?
They crack me up. I mean, it's hilarious. I mean, even in as recent as Esslemont's book, Forge of the High
Towards the High
Mage,
Mage, yeah.
he has some just really funny stuff with historians, and they're
And cartographers take a bit of a dig in there too.
yeah, yeah, especially at the end. Spoiler or yeah, no
That's not really
spoilers, but yeah, it's
yeah.
Um,
But yes, they're famous for presenting history in a light that is basically a bit skeptical, right?
yeah,
About the veracity of accounts that are put forward as
right,
the truth, right?
right. I'd say
Alternative
Malazan.
looks
Sorry,
at
sorry.
these. No, no, that's okay. I think there's something you're. I know I've heard you talk about with Stephen Erickson because you're also interested in oral history and other
Yes.
forms of history, which are just really we're just beginning to explore in ways that really give us a much fuller picture of the past. Whereas we definitely privilege certain voices and certain modes of narration when it comes to history, haven't we?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, and I'd say all of the Malazan world historians are very much slaves to their environments and whatever
Yeah.
political situation they kind of serve or
Yeah.
represent.
And there's
And
varying
yeah,
degrees of awareness of that too.
yes, yeah, oh yeah,
And
I
some
yeah,
are just propagandists, you know.
right, yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, they don't care.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, no, I actually I love that sort of thing. I love the kind of more skeptical, like throwing any sense of well, I don't want to say throwing any sense of objectivity to the wind, because
Mhm.
it is important for historians to have sources, cite their sources, make sure they're being at least as transparent as possible
Yeah.
about their process. But I think when historians are transparent enough, they'll start to show their own biases. And I think that's great to see those. But then everyone reading any work of history can say, oh, okay, yeah, there's nothing particularly objective in here. Yeah. And so I like how Erickson and Esslemont poke fun at that.
Yeah.
And yeah. A lot of my grad school peers might not, but
That's funny. Yeah, because I think there's one of my favorite professors when I was in college was a scientist, was a geologist. And something she taught me about science in general, but her field in particular, which she's was a master of, was the fact that what we think we know right now will not be what we think we know in a decade,
right.
or certainly not in 50 years. And so what we know is the hard and fact, yes, this is definitely that can change, you know. So there's a certain kind of humility, I think, that in any discipline should be present,
Right.
because we you do want to be able to say, here's what we think happened
Right.
in the past, right? And here are the lenses we're using to come to these conclusions. You want to be able to say that as an historian, I'm sure.
Yeah.
um, but I think that the humility of recognizing maybe some things will come to light that will change the way these events are perceived, for example, or maybe there'll be alternative accounts that people will investigate that will give us a very different picture of what's happened, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think one of my favorite, I can't even call him a historian because he isn't exactly. He's a historical theorist, Hayden White, and I guess he's an expert in linguistics and hermeneutics and these sorts of things.
Yeah.
He wrote a book called Meta History. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this.
I haven't
Um,
read it.
it's I think it's brilliant. Again, this is something that I could go back and forth with my grad school cohort with for a while, but it's all about how historians in the 19th century were all writing through these different like lenses, and he breaks it down very structurally, and like here's the 3 different political viewpoints they could have been using, and then here's the 4 different modes of emplotment they could have been going for, and then mixing and matching and applying all of those. And ultimately, the point, I guess, is any work by those historians is a lot more about that historian and what kind of community they were writing from within and like they were writing for than it necessarily says about the time period that it's supposed to be covering. I find that stuff fascinating.
Yeah. I do too. Actually, it was interestingly, at least to me, this is very relevant to my work that I did in my dissertation, which was more than 20 years ago, but I was looking at William Morris's translations of Icelandic sagas and his translation of Beowulf, but in the context of the language that he was using. And he was very much informed in his approach by 19th century historians who, in many ways, were part of the this neo-Gothic, medievalism that you find. It was a big part of the 19th century, very much in part as a reaction against industrialism and against capitalism. There's this nostalgic, the good old days when there was this social hierarchy where people took care of each other, and you had the nobles and they were great and they took care of the peasants and they were grateful and all of this. And so you had it was reactionary in some sense. But interestingly, that reactionary thing could sometimes, to our ears, sound very radical, because they were very critical of capitalism and industrialism, which were the new kids on the block in the 19th century. So people would read somebody like John Ruskin or Thomas Carlyle from the 19th century, and they sound like radicals, because they're critiquing capitalism and industrialism, but in some ways they're very reactionary, and they're part of this idealizing of the past, particularly the medieval past. And in the case of William Morris, he took a lot of this critiques of capitalism and industrialism, and he went all the way to becoming a socialist and very involved in the socialist movement in the 19th century. So. I mean, it's fascinating, but this is a long way of saying that history was very much in the service of putting forward a politically motivated vision of the past.
Yeah.
So a lot of the historians like Edward Freeman and William Stubbs and these kinds of individuals were very much operating from a place of trying to idealize, particularly the Germanic medieval, the Dark Ages, the Old English and all that stuff, and making it sound like they were very egalitarian and communal and all of that. And then the Normans came along with all this French influence, and it became very hierarchical and mean. So and urban, So in other words, history is definitely something that people have manipulated in order to assert their vision for society of the present.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
And now I want to hear what you study actually as a historian. I mentioned that you're interested in oral history to some degree. I know that you're an expert on Native American history.
So I definitely wouldn't call myself an expert, even though that's the job I find myself in is for a Native American museum. I run and operate a museum. In grad school, I studied more broadly comparative genocide studies. And a lot of what we focused on there was Holocaust studies, which for a quick breakdown, some people that study genocide just focus very specifically on like the Holocaust. Some like to say, okay, what was different in the 90s and Rwanda versus what was happening in Armenia at the beginning of the 20th century. So I was more in the latter camp of genocide studies, and because of that experience, and in the university or the University of Missouri, Kansas City is where I did my grad school. They focused a lot on public history and oral history stuff. So those things kind of just meshed nicely when I was applying for the oral history job for the Seminole tribe in South Florida here.
How
Uh,
cool is that? Yeah.
yeah, it's a wonderful job, and I've learned so much just about how different communities, different cultures view how much should be shared, how much should be preserved, and even widely like publicly available, things like that. Really fascinating learning experience. And then because I never really focused on studying Native American history, much less Seminole history,
Yeah.
or Creek, Miccosukee, kind of all the different communities down here, or indigenous communities down here. Um, Most of my learning of their culture and their history has come through my work transcribing their old interviews and things like that. So
Wow. Wow.
I'm learning firsthand from them and not the books that have been written about them. So I feel very fortunate and just to be having this experience and this kind of introduction to their culture. Yeah.
Yeah, that is really awesome. Yeah. I'm kind of
Yeah.
jealous, actually.
Sorry.
Yeah. Really
Well,
cool.
my commute is a little over an hour each way, so maybe that'll
Oh,
help
well,
you
then
guys.
I'm not as
Yeah,
jealous.
because
Yeah.
I live on
My,
the coast, and the museum's out on the reservation in the middle of the state.
oh,
So
okay.
yeah.
My commute is 7 minutes, so
Oh, lovely.
no, but I mean, all this really makes me think, okay, we were knocking history just a little bit in the Malazan spirit a moment ago, but you're talking about Holocaust studies and you're talking about studying from primary sources the history of these tribes.
Mhm.
That's so important, and history has a very important role to play. And we're living in a time when, like the rest of the humanities, history is under attack
Oh my gosh, yeah.
in higher education. And you have all kinds of idiots proposing just eliminating history from the curriculum entirely. And I'm just going, what? How can you even think that? Because we already have an issue with people not really understanding their own democracy here and needing some civic awareness. And
Right, right.
history has a huge role to play in helping to produce informed citizens so that we have a healthy democracy. So history is important too, isn't it?
Yeah. And oh my gosh, just living in Florida adds a whole
Oh
other
gosh,
thing
yeah.
to.
Talk about attacks on education.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
yeah. Sorry, we don't need to get too depressed, but yeah, I'm sure you're much more painfully aware of this thing with your career and your work, but
I am, we're here to fight the good fight, but it's frustrating to be in this moment when it feels like so many people who are coming at education from a very corporate minded kind of attitude
mhm.
are kind of taking over. They're taking over the managerial positions, the administrations and stuff like that, and they're viewing students as customers. And they're pretty much, their attitude is often, well, just give the customers what they want. Students aren't interested in philosophy or history or literature. They just want their piece of paper that lets them, get this job. So just let them do what they want, and that's the attitude. And I understand I'm characterizing it in a very uncharitable way right now because I disagree with that stance, but it's tragic to me. It's tragic to me that we're in this place right now where we're questioning the usefulness of the humanities in our culture. At least, and this is what it really bothers me. It's not happening at the so-called elite institutions. They're still giving their students plenty of humanities. It's happening places where I work. I work at a community college. So it feels like people are saying, well, this is good enough for those students.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And that really bothers me a lot.
Yeah.
The idea that we're going to have two kinds of education systems, one for people who can afford to go to the elite institutions, or who are lucky enough to get into them, and then there's the rest. And the disparity between this and this is getting big. This gap is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, because the quality, I mean, we're fighting in the classrooms trying to uphold what we're doing, and it feels like we're being attacked from left and right and all over the place. Yeah, so it's not the best time for higher education in many ways. Yeah.
So yeah, I'm considering more and more going back to school to continue my education and work on a PhD. The program that's really got my eye right now is FAU's Comparative Studies program.
Okay.
But yeah, I don't know. It's just so many people I've spoken with, and I'm trying to feel it out, and I'm trying to talk with people who've been in the program, who are aware of just the system in general right now across the country, the higher education, I guess, status of things, and it's just so pessimistic. And I mean, it even was that way when I was in grad school for my public history degree, because the whole almost every other class, someone would bring up a question of like, okay, well, how do we apply this in a job? And like, how are we going to get jobs with this? And some professor would say, oh, well, there's 15 of you in here. 5 of you will probably have a job right after this. And that's unfortunately how a lot of it went. It was a very upsetting and pessimistic thing, but I loved it, and I loved the education process, and I love going to lectures, and especially like the colloquium style class where you read a book in a week and then you meet the next week to talk about it. It's a book club for like the nerdiest nerds. I just love that.
Oh, I loved learning. I loved all my degrees, but for the first time in my career, I seriously have started to feel like if a young person were to ask me about a career as an English professor, I feel like I'm more negative than positive. And that's just in the last few years. I'm more likely to say, it's not so good right now. And I want to be honest with those people, because this is their future, and I would have said 5-6 years ago, this is a great career. This is a wonderful life. There are some worrying things going on and trends, but we've reached this point where now I don't think I would advise a young person. I feel so sad saying that.
Right.
But I don't think I would advise a young person to do a PhD in anything in the humanities right now, unless they're really, really, really passionate and that's all they can see themselves doing. And then go for it. But just understand, you may end up with a job that has nothing to do with your degree.
Right. And I of course I also have a wedding coming up in March, so that's also another thank you. But the whole, so how much is the wedding gonna cost? And I'm gonna need, or how much has it cost already? I need,
I would guess it's
a scholarship, fellowships, these sorts of assistance, these sorts of things I'd be applying to if I do the PhD program. And even then they say you're not supposed to have another job outside of the assistantship, but it's impossible.
If you'd pay me enough, then I wouldn't need to.
Right. But so I don't know. We'll see what happens. And my job right now, the commute is honestly the biggest problem, and it's not even that I don't like driving. It's just that's an extra 2.5 hours out of the day that I could be spending time with my fiance, or I could be, helping out around.
I hope you have some good audiobooks or something.
Well, I actually struggle listening to audiobooks, but I have started, for a first read of anything, I struggle paying attention and focusing. I have started the Malazan stuff in audiobook, because I figure, this is an easy enough way to return to books that I know pretty well by this point, but I can just, spend the morning drive with Torvald and Parsa, or yeah, whoever. Not
Nice.
that those two characters ever have anything to do with each other.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I mean, I don't listen to audiobooks, but if I had a 1 hour commute, I would start listening to audiobooks.
I
So.
listened to a lot of your Dear Dr. Fantasy episodes.
Oh, cool. Yeah. During
um,
the commute. Yes. Yeah,
I
good.
listened to a lot of Jimmy's Chatting with Nuts stuff.
Yep, yep, yep.
Because I always, a lot of times with the live stuff, I can't, or like I'm not in a good schedule, or like I'm not it's just not a good moment for me to sit down and join the chat live, but I
Yeah.
usually go back after the fact and catch up. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I'm happy to be listened to during someone's commute.
Yeah.
Maybe there's somebody listening to us right now who's commuting.
Oh,
So
maybe. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's me making sure I didn't say anything stupid.
that's funny. I will admit I've done that before too. I'm like, wait, did I say? I better listen to that discussion. And usually it hasn't been as bad as I thought. But nice. Okay, well, this has been fun so far, but
Right.
we should probably talk about some of the books. Like, so you
Oh,
did
yeah.
Fortitude High Mage recently, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Um,
loved it, by the way. I think it's slightly separated from the first three
right.
books that are in the Path to Ascendancy, but it's being put in that series.
Right.
So, which is
Yeah.
fine, it's great. We're still getting stuff that happened before Malazan Book of the Fallen and novels of the Malazan Empire. So that works. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The main character emphasis is definitely shifted a bit. And I think that's good. I don't want to say too much without or
We can't say a
or
ton
spoilers,
because of
right.
spoilers, but it's fine to say, and this is a Malazan thing. Esslemont gives us a lot to think about in terms of certain characters and how we conceive of those characters, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about history and how our view of the past can change with new evidence. Same thing with a Malazan character. You think you know this character from Malazan Book of the Fallen, and maybe you don't even like that character. But then Esslemont comes and gives you this background. You think, oh wait, I maybe not only do I understand this guy now, but I kind of like him even.
Right, right. A sort of a window into that character's growth,
Yeah,
but we know that character's never going to let anyone else see how much he's grown. But
right.
it's nice that we know now that Esslemont let us see it, even if no one else in the world
Yeah,
really, or even if it's not communicated well.
yeah. That's
Beating around the bush.
a fun Malazan thing, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And many
Um,
other Malazan things go on in this as well. It's just great to be back in that world, and I love the way Esslemont handles religion. Which
yeah.
I was talking to AP about the book, and we have a whole big spoiler discussion on it. But Esslemont, in a couple of his books, has really taken religion on as a theme, and in a way that's very respectful and very subtle and everything nuanced. So he did it in Stone Wielder, and
Mhm.
he's done it again, I think, in Forge of the High Mage. So it's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think those are actually maybe my two favorites of his. So I wonder if that I hadn't drawn that connection, but that might be a big reason why I like those so much. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, you know that I, in my own writing, religion is pretty central. So
Oh yeah.
definitely speaks to me. Yeah.
I love Bledla.
Oh.
I know it is maybe a weird take. I don't know, but there's one scene in particular. Oh yeah, how to say it without spoiling it, but I expected him to have a more malicious, kind of vicious, evil reaction
Yeah.
to finding something out. But
Yeah.
he had much more of a nuanced, afraid, kind of paranoid reaction that
Yeah.
wasn't so much. It wasn't so much the doing like jumping to the most wicked thing he could do. Like it
Yeah.
actually made sense. And I don't know. I really love, at least so far, what's going on with him.
Yeah, no, I think that if you just read the early chapter with Bledlow, you think, oh, villain, bad guy.
Right.
He's
Right.
horrible. I don't like him. But what I try to do in this case, and there are different ways you can do it, but in this case, I tried to introduce a little more nuance into his character as the first book progresses, to a point where you might not agree with what he's doing. You probably don't.
Right.
But he becomes, I think, much more than just a mustache twirling villain. I hope, anyway, that he has motives that are okay. They're human, and they're understandable, and to a degree, even if you disagree. But he genuinely believes that he is doing the right thing. He genuinely feels that he is doing what is best for the world, and he does so in a way that is, you could argue, it's about his ego in many ways, but from his perspective, it's an unselfish endeavor that he's involved in, that he's doing this for a bigger thing, something much bigger than himself. And yeah, no, I think he's somebody that I can see facets of myself in, that he's a human, that I don't identify with what he's trying to do at all, but there have been points in my life where I believed in something very, very hard, to the point where I felt like it was important to spread the word about it, right? So yeah, I tried to make him a little nuanced, and the others like Yorman as well, and try to, even though I think if somebody wants to call them bad guys or villains, I'm fine with that, but I hope that there's some nuance to them at the same time. Yeah.
I'm really looking forward to Prophet of Adan.
I see it there
Don Adan
over
is
your shoulder.
Yeah.
Nice.
There you go.
Thank you for featuring that. Yes.
Yeah, beautiful artwork too. What's the artist that does?
Kira Gregory. Yeah. Their name is on the back, and also the cover designer, Jack Shepard, is really very intricately involved in what you see there on the cover. So he's fantastic to work with. Both of them, Kira and Jack, have been really great. I'm excited for the third cover, which is going to be happening soon. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah. I don't know if I want to spoil things, but the third cover is something I'm excited about. I think it's going to make a great stained glass window. So
is it a particular character's representation, or
it is? Yes, there is a character. What the heck? I'll just say the third cover is going to feature a character that no one has met yet.
Oh, cool. Okay.
That is not in the first two books.
Okay.
But is very important in the third book.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Ooh, I have guesses already. Is it a character that I know? I've heard the name of this character at least several times.
Yeah, I can't go into that. I guess. Kind of, sort of, maybe.
Okay.
So yeah, we'll see. Kind of, sort of, maybe. So there are connections, though. There's stuff that I do in the first book that won't really come to fruition until the end of the third. And some characters that you met in the first book who do not appear in the second, but come back in the third. Yeah.
Was it always this structure? Like, did it always begin? Did the first book begin where it did, and the third one was going to end where it did, or has it always been
the way I conceived of this trilogy from the beginning was to make the first part of the first book more or less the departure, in sort of hero's journey terms, right? And this is in the context mostly of Dayraven, but there are other ways of thinking about this. So departure meaning leaving home, leaving the familiar, leaving one's cultural assumptions behind, being stripped of one's identity, leaving the womb, that sort of thing. So that's the first book, is really focused on the departure. The second book is focused on transcendence.
Okay.
So becoming something greater than yourself.
Okay.
Becoming something that becoming something in response to struggles and difficulties, having to transcend what you are, having to become something greater. So there's a lot of that in book 2. And then book 3, which is called Return to Edan, is the return. And in many senses of the word, I think people will find. But yeah, it's about the return. So departure, transcendence, return. And that's the simplest way to think of a hero's journey, really, when you think about, all kinds of stories, myths, and stuff. So that's the structure, I guess, that I had in mind.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely on my TBR for the rest of the year, along with those other fantasy romances.
Yeah.
There's not a ton of romance, and there's some like off the page.
In my books.
Yeah, stuff.
Yeah, so I do tend to fade to black
Okay.
when there's sexy time.
Sure, yeah.
So it's funny because we were talking about it earlier, and I'm American. I'm a New England Puritan descendant of Puritans myself. So I'm uncomfortable, and I actually did try to write scenes and realized this makes me uncomfortable.
Okay, yeah.
It probably will make other people uncomfortable. I don't need to do this probably, although in theory, I'm fine with that. In theory,
Right.
I have no objection to sex in stories if it's part of the story and
Right.
forwards the story. I'm not a huge fan of it when it's gratuitous and just obviously there to get, so, but anyway, yeah, I chose to essentially not have any explicit things going on in those terms in any of the books. It happens, and it happens, but it's on page, and that's more in book 2 and 3. I don't think there's anything really in the first book much. There's a little bit kissing, I guess.
Yeah, I know there's one priest gets
Yes. Oh, yes, that's true.
but
yeah. It's after. It's right afterwards. So yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean that particular individual is yeah.
that scene was that I think that helped to
It's
helped
part of
me
his
understand
character.
him. Yeah.
Yeah. So the decision making, the layers there were okay. This event is part of his character. Does it forward his arc to describe the act, or can I just start after? And I realized, yeah, you don't really need to get into it.
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't add anything really, and people can put 2 and 2 together there. So, yeah. Yeah, so that's how I approached it in my own writing, and even though I think I'm pretty brutal in terms of the violence. I think it's
yeah, especially yeah.
And the goal there is, of course, I don't want to present violence in a way that makes it feel like it's being glorified.
Yeah.
So I want to be honest about it, which is something that I see, more in more modern fantasy, particularly grimdark kind of fantasy, where I feel like there's an honesty going on there when it comes to violence and its effects on people and its causes, much more so than in classical fantasy, where nobody has PTSD or
right.
and thousands and thousands of orcs die, and it's like, well, where's the next battle?
Right.
So yeah, I wanted to be honest as much as I could.
Yeah, it's definitely not fun. I mean, it's an enjoyable read, but not in like the fun way of
hopefully,
it.
yeah, engaging or compelling.
Right.
Yeah. That's the goal anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't say too much about what books I read when I was growing up.
Yes, yeah, we can go back to that. Yeah,
Uh,
we didn't really get very
all
far
right.
in your reading journey. So yeah, what else is important for explaining the person you are today?
So I think there's only one other person, and I might be wrong. I don't think I've watched like every single Dear Doctor Fantasy episode, but there's only one other person that I've heard mention this series. And I think it was Bookborn. Um, and it's a kids series, and they're called The Secrets of Droon, by Tony Abbott.
Okay.
And it's just a portal fantasy. Three kids find a portal in their basement, and there's a magic carpet and a princess that needs saving. And
Oh,
yeah, and they were on those little like turn standing things at the library, and so I would always go and get the first two, three, four, five, whatever, really little tiny books, and I
oh.
read those and I loved them. I think there's something like 20 or 30, but I never really got too far in that series. Similar to like Magic Tree House, I only ever read the first 8 or 9.
Uh,
Yeah, but I read the ones that I did read a lot. I don't know why. I just kept going back to
oh, that's
the
what kids do. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. But yeah, so that was important. Secrets of Drone. And then Harry Potter, my dad read the first 3 books to my brother and I to give an
Oh,
age kind of sense. But then like by the time the fourth one was coming up, I have a twin brother, and
oh,
he and
cool.
I think we were both at the same point where we were like, no, no, Dad, we're gonna break out on our own. We're gonna read this one because we're big kids now.
Right.
So yeah, we read Goblet of Fire, the fourth Harry Potter, and got really into that whole thing. Uh,
Nice. Now, are you like the Weasleys, identical brothers or fraternal?
so we're technically we're not 100% sure either way. We're
Oh,
most likely fraternal.
okay.
We look a lot alike. Less so now. He has longer hair and sometimes grows a mustache.
Oh,
He's doing Peace Corps work in Uganda right now.
oh,
Um,
wow. Okay.
yeah. um, but we're pretty sure we're fraternal because of other things, embryonic sac detail. I don't know exactly how they made that determination, but they never did like the blood work or like the blood test to verify whether or not we were. Uh,
So how many would there placenta, right? I mean, would there be 2 placentas if you were fraternal and one if you're identical or
so I think typically there would be one if we were identical, two if we were fraternal,
yeah.
unless it formed like or like unless it formed late or early or something like that, and
Okay.
then like yeah, so and they couldn't really tell, so we're
Interesting.
most likely fraternal. Yeah.
Okay.
And he most of the fantasy series that I love and everything, I'm kind of like the the friend that you get into something, you're like, oh, you should check out the show, and then they come back and they've read everything related to it. They've watched past the point that you're at, and they've sort of taken over your love of it. Like they've
Right.
yeah, sort of
That's you.
that's me. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, like he got me into Game of Thrones. He
But
got
you
me
did with your fiance with Outlander, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the same sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, yeah,
So
so
you did Song of Ice and Fire just the show?
well, so he got me into the show, and then he was reading the books. Like I think season 3 was about to start, something like that. And he watched the first few episodes of season 1 and he loved it. And he said, no, I want to read the books first because there's at that point there were the 5th book had just been published, I think.
Okay.
And so he said, I have to read these before I watch their corresponding season. So
Okay.
he did it that way. And I was just like, oh no, I'm reading other stuff. I was actually reading a lot of Orson Scott Card at that
Uh-huh.
time,
Uh-huh.
a lot of sci-fi kind of stuff at that time. And I said, I don't know about the whole fantasy thing. This
Huh.
is late high school, early college years. But then he said, no, you have to sit down and watch the first 3 seasons of the show. And so then before season 4 came out, I read the 5 books because I love the TV show so much. And yeah, that's also probably why the 4th book is my favorite, or it's a big reason why the 4th one's my favorite when it's not
That's unusual. Yeah.
right. But I think a big part of it is that it was the first time that an entire book I was reading that I hadn't already seen any kind of adaptation or any kind of what HBO and David and Dan did with it. So
I actually had read all the books that were out before watching the show. So I had my own ideas, and I enjoyed most of the show until, I mean, even season 7, I can find moments that I like.
Yeah.
The 8th season, even up until the last couple episodes.
Yeah, I think there's like episode 2 or something like that in the 8th season. I find a lot of enjoyable moments there.
Stuff there, but oh my goodness, the last episode of the whole thing, I thought they were playing a prank. I actually thought, wait, this is a joke ending, right? This is not real. They're not going to do this. And they did it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was that bad. I actually thought they were playing a prank.
Yeah, I just, so many of the decisions that characters were making made no sense to me. And it was just so strange. Like I was just scratching my head, and
I mean, it reminded me of the end, and Monty Python did it on purpose at the end of the Holy Grail. It reminded me of that ending. You know, it was like, wait, what? No.
So, funny story. My brother and I got that or rented that on like VHS, I think, from the library when we were kids, and we thought we didn't have a complete. We were missing a tape because. Or like it was a 2-tape thing, and we were like, "What happened?" Like, or it was crashed in it. Like, get to the end. Yeah.
That's how I felt watching the last episode of a Game of Thrones. It was like, or Game of Thrones, they called the TV show.
Right.
Oh my God, what did they do?
Yeah. Oh well, and I just I'm enjoying the Rise of the Dragon show. Is that what it's called? Or House of the Dragon?
Oh, House of the Dragon.
Yeah. I'm enjoying that a lot.
I actually only watched the first 5 episodes of that.
Okay.
Not because I didn't stop because I disliked it or anything. I just stopped because I have no time for screens.
Okay, yeah.
I'm reading so much. But oh well. So did your brother ever get into Malazan, or is that something you did on your own?
No, so he did. And he's actually, I think he's either rereading them or also listening to them on audiobook.
Okay.
While he's in Uganda.
So that's a shared thing too then.
Okay. Yes, yeah. Well, so I got into that sort of before he did. He said, some conversation I remember when we were watching the Game of Thrones TV show, and he was getting me hooked. He was starting out that obsession for me. He said, so now that I've read these 5 books, my buddy recommended these 2 other really massive fantasy series that I might like if I like this. Okay. And those were Malazan by Stephen Erickson, or Malazan Book of the Fallen, and Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan.
Of course, yeah.
Right. And so Nathan, my brother, his name's Nathan, he got Gardens of the Moon, and I guess he started it, and he was telling me how kind of intriguing it was. But then he just didn't finish it then. And then around like 2015, I want to say, is when I saw it on a shelf, and I was like, you know what? I'm actually getting a little more into fantasy now. I think I'll pick up Gardens of the Moon. Okay. I read that and Dead House Gates in one summer, and I loved it. Took me about a year to read both Memories of Ice and House of Chains. I think I just wasn't reading a ton that year, and school was kind of busy. But then summer of 2016, I read like all the Balkaland and Corbel Broach novellas that were out.
Oh, you read the novellas? Okay.
Yeah, I love them. Yeah, I read all those. I read a couple of Esslemont's books then, and I burned through like Midnight Tides, Bone Hunters, Reaper's Gale, and I was just having a blast. And but then I kind of started to jump back and forth to do more publication order stuff between Erickson and Esslemont, and then so like where that kind of left me off, I read The Crippled God in May 2017.
Okay.
And then I read Blood and Bone right after it.
Okay.
And I was, which for anyone watching not too familiar with Esslemont's series, that's the fifth in his main series of 6 books.
Yeah.
And
And that is publication order at that point you're doing. Yeah.
right. But then I was a little bit burned out on Malazan. So I took a
Oh,
break, I took a year-long break, and not burned out in that I wasn't enjoying it so much, but just I was through that process, I was discovering booktube, and
uh-huh.
Daniel Green was kind of starting out around then. We're like 2017 there now, and
Yeah, I
that
don't
kind
know
of
when he
period.
started. Yeah. Yeah.
I think he was starting out around then. And there were these 2 guys named, like, I think Momo and Duncan or something like that, and they were doing a read through of Malazan Book of the Fallen.
Oh,
And
wow. I don't know them. Yeah.
yeah, this was like, 6 years ago or 5 years ago or something now.
Huh.
And so I just started to listen to them, and I was like, okay, yeah, no, they're talking about other series, and they're constantly comparing this to other things, and I thought I need to read. Who's this Brandon Sanderson guy? I need to
Yeah.
read yeah, read Wheel of Time. I need to give that a try. So I
Yep.
took a break to read like Wise or not Wise Man's Fear, Name of the Wind
Yeah.
by Patrick Rothfuss. I read the first 4 or so Wheel of Time books pretty quickly there.
Uh-huh.
I read, trying to think, I think in that time frame, I read Master of White Storm, one of Jenny Wirtz's standalone novels.
Yes. Yes. Yeah.
That's very, very good. I'm not sure if you've read that
I haven't
one.
read that one yet. Yeah, for the standalones, I've only read To Ride Hell's Chasm.
Okay. Um, yeah, but then we were going on a trip to Europe in May of 2018. So it had been about a year since I had picked up anything Malazan, and I thought, you know what, I should continue with this stuff. And I brought with me a copy of A Sail, Esslemont's 6th book, and then Forge of Darkness, the first Carcanis book. And there is nothing. I maybe part of my attachment to the Carcanis trilogy and why I love like Forge of Darkness so much is like being on a train from Prague to Munich and like looking
Wow.
out at the landscape after I've just
Yeah.
read some really powerful passage of Erickson's. Like that was just such an interesting, such a memorable reading experience.
Sounds wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess I took another long break before finally reading Fall of Light, the novellas that had been published that I hadn't read, and then The Goddess Not Willing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, cool. Wow.
So that's kind of the brief history of my Malazan reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say exactly how many books, but and they keep adding to it. So
Yeah.
we're getting close to 30 now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Any other big important reads in your journey?
I do want to talk about something an interesting read of mine that you
Okay.
know a thing or two about. And I have several questions about this.
Okay.
So this is Beowulf. You might be
Beowulf.
familiar, right?
I'm slightly familiar with that one.
Right. So the versions and my reading experience of Beowulf, it's a little bit unusual, and I guess I was hoping if maybe you could help recommend a good translation,
Oh,
help
sure. Yeah.
maybe sort through the kind of mess of how I discovered this story.
Huh.
So what happened was, and I wish I could remember more of this initial kind of introduction to the story, but there was this summer camp in at Truman State University in northern Missouri,
Okay.
which is where I wound up doing my undergrad. But the whole idea was get middle schoolers and like early high schoolers into like a college setting for 3 weeks over the summer and into a college-esque class
Okay.
to give them a sense of what it's all about. And like we got to live in the dorms. It was a lot of fun.
Hmm.
But the class that I took the third year I went there was an Old English slash Beowulf introduction class.
Okay.
Again, I was like, how old would that be? This was probably between eighth grade and ninth grade. So
Oh my goodness. Okay.
right. And so I hate that I can't remember more of this experience. And
Yeah.
obviously I didn't retain any of the Old English lessons that they really gave us.
Wait, they were trying to teach you Beowulf when you were in 8th grade in Old English?
Well, so the whole thing was it was structured like a language course. And then we would read passages from Beowulf in
In Old
Old
English.
English to try and get the pronunciation right. And then we'd go through what it was like. We'd read a translation next to it. And it was just a short 3 week long summer kind of thing.
So
Um,
really just tasting it, I guess, a little.
right. The coolest thing about it was that the professor, and I can't remember her name. I think she was still a professor there when I went to Truman, like actually like when I was a student at Truman.
When you were old.
But she she was in the English department. I was history. But what she had us do was she had us all make like costumes and stuff to be like period appropriate for Beowulf and then
Yeah.
perform scenes from the story in Old English and like memorize the line. Again, it was very short kind of segments. But yeah, so that was a very strange introduction to the story.
Yeah.
And then in my
Okay,
like
so,
AP Lit class, my last year in high school, we
uh-huh.
read a version of it that was in a textbook, which is
Okay.
not how I prefer to read my books.
Right.
Bound up in a textbook with all these other stories.
An
So
anthology. Yeah.
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 Um,
With the toilet paper, thin paper.
yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So you want to know what I think of as a good translation? I always recommend the Seamus Heaney
Okay.
translation.
Okay.
I think he does a great job of balancing the actual meaning of the original with a kind of aesthetic that conveys something of the sense of Old English poetry with its
Okay.
alliteration and its 4 stresses per line, and even when it was recorded, the manuscript is from about 1000 or so, 1000 AD, and the language of it is archaic, so even for people of its time.
Okay.
So in other words, it was old fashioned even when it was new, in some ways. And so Seamus Heaney does, I think, a good job of inserting words in there that give it that sense of being kind of old timey in a way.
Okay, cool. Okay.
So I like his translation a lot, and that's the one I use when I teach it. When I read it for myself, I read it in Old English, though, which is to me a much better experience than any translation. But I'm kind of unique that way around here. So yeah, but yeah, that sounds like a very strange thing to do to 8th graders.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
me, but okay. I honestly think it's probably most high schools are not ready for Beowulf, and that it might be better to teach somebody or expose someone to it for the first time in college,
Mhm.
because there are a lot of themes in there about life's fleetingness and about the loss of family and friends, and these are things that I don't think young people would necessarily think about. I mean, certainly some young people have been through a lot and would think of
Sure.
these things, but most of the time, these are things that you think about your own mortality a lot more, I think, as you get older. So it's like, which Shakespeare do you teach to kids? Well, Romeo and
Yeah.
Juliet. We'll start them on that, and then
Right.
when you're old, you read King Lear.
Uh,
And in between, you can read Hamlet. So
right,
uh,
right.
finding the right age for the text is not always easy, but yeah. So So do you have a clear sense of Beowulf from those experiences, or do you have questions?
I have a clear sense of the basic plot kind of beats, like what happens in it, but I didn't. I don't think in either experience I got anything particularly rewarding out of it.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
the summer camp program class, I got a lot out of being in that sort of college style class setting
Yeah.
more than the specifics of the Old English language and what was happening in Beowulf. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's a mistake to approach the text as a series of 3 monster slayings.
Uh-huh.
And if you're just going to summarize the plot of Beowulf, that's what it is.
Right.
Spoilers for Beowulf, everybody. Beowulf kills Grendel. Beowulf kills Grendel's mother. Beowulf kills a dragon 50 years later. That's it. So you're not going to really understand what I think the poet was trying to explore by reading it that way. I think of the poem as a lament for the past. More than an epic, it's a lament. And what you have in Beowulf is most likely a Christian poet writing in, perhaps the actual date of origin is a matter of debate, but I like to go with the 8th century, which is on the earlier side. Whatever, whenever it was originally composed, because the manuscript again is from 1000, but the story, it was copied and that sort of thing. So it's much older than the manuscript is, the version of the story that we have. Now, this poet, whoever he was, whether he lived in the 8th century or whatever, was using a much, much, much older story that had been around for probably centuries in various Germanic cultures. We know this because there are analogs to Beowulf in Old Norse. Like in Grettir's saga, you'll see an account of the Grendel and Grendel's mother slaying. It's you'll recognize it if you read Grettir's saga. You'll be like, oh, well, that's just like Beowulf. There are other sagas with similar events. So it's an old story that has been repurposed by this, let's say, recent convert to Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons. And I think that, of course, Beowulf is about this person's or ancestors, or people like this person's ancestors from roughly the 6th century or so. And they were pagan. So the Christian poet is looking back on his pagan ancestors with a sense of admiration for their courage and their loyalty and their honor and all of those qualities that are part of the heroic code that Beowulf embodies, but also with a sense of its futility, because Beowulf's response to life's fleetingness, to the darkness that ultimately swallows everyone, is do great deeds so that your name will live on. The bard will tell stories of you, which is admirable, but from the Christian poet's perspective, futile, ultimately. So there's this sense of, I think, almost sorrow that pervades the poem as the poet really puts forward his own perspective on things, giving us a sense of the nobility of these people and their ways, but also the futility of their response to mortality. Not with a sense of condemnation, not with a sense of judgment, but just a kind of sorrow, I think, from that poet. That's how I read it. Anyway. Okay. So there's all these side stories that really reinforce these themes of life's fleetingness and seeing this tapestry of the past with this sense of sorrow. And it displays a lot of the hallmarks of oral formulaic storytelling as well. For example, apposition, it proceeds in a very stately manner. And it's never just Beowulf went and said this. It's Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, the great warrior, unlocked his breast hoard and said these words, and so you see this building on each other. And that's how the bard would be telling the story, to the audience. It's a kind of mnemonic device for the bard to just insert line here, next part, insert line here, So that's how a oral formulaic poem works, right? And while this was recorded, so it was written, so literacies enter the equation, it still exhibits many of the qualities of oral formulaic storytelling. So,
Okay.
yeah. I don't know if that helps you appreciate it anymore or not, but
Oh yeah, yeah, and I mean, especially that's a lot for me to kind of bring with me into my. I'm planning to read it sometime soon,
okay,
in a more, in a more comfortable setting, um,
cool.
where
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, awesome. Very good. Well, I wish you luck with that and
Thank
with
you.
everything. Anything else you want to touch on before we say goodbye to everybody?
Well, there's a lot of kind of different things that I read. I'm trying to think of if there's one or two that are like really. I mean, of course, Lord of the Rings is important, but
Oh gosh, how can we leave that out? Yeah.
right, right. That was a weird reading experience, I suppose, in the way that I read in seventh grade. I read The Hobbit for one class, and then I read Two Towers for another class. Between those, I had read Fellowship of the Ring.
Okay.
And so, but like I had like a book report on The Hobbit and Two Towers, but I never did any for Fellowship. And
Okay.
so then I finished it out, and I enjoyed it. Like I thought they were good stories at that age, and I loved the films. But then my brother got really into Lord of the Rings and
Uh-oh.
into the Silmarillion and Christopher Tolkien's histories of Middle Earth and all that stuff.
Uh-oh.
And so then he got me back into it, kind of, or drew me back around to enjoying it. And this was like end of high school time period when I was, I think, through like my English classes at the end of high school had taught me, or they'd given me so many more skills to bring to reading and just literature. And
Yeah.
so getting back into something like Lord of the Rings and also like reading Dune around then for the first time, I was realizing, oh, cool, I can actually take the stuff that I've been learning in school with some of these books that I might not like as much and apply them to the
Right,
stories that
right,
I
right.
really, really do enjoy. Oh my gosh, we read The Great Gatsby, senior
Oh,
year of high school. I'm not a fan of The Great Gatsby. But that book taught me the valuable lesson that I can understand a story and still not get it, or it's still not enjoy it. I still not understand why other people might enjoy it as much as they do.
right, right, right. That's
but
fair.
but
Yeah.
yeah, so just reading stuff like that and then taking what I'm learning from those and applying that to things like Lord of the Rings and Dune, and then I also got really into Isaac Asimov, and I read
Oh,
all of his robot stuff and his Foundation books.
oh,
And
oh.
um yeah, yeah, I think I only have one video on my channel about Asimov, but I should do more because I was pretty obsessed with Asimov for a while there. um
Cool. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. You can always go back to.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, that's awesome. Yeah,
um
hopefully your channel will be a long time, where you'll be able to go back to some of those reads, and because
yeah.
I feel that way too about some of the stuff that I read prior to starting a channel, and I've never made videos on this stuff, even though it's some of my favorite stuff, because I'm reading other stuff for the channel
Right,
all the
right.
time. So yeah. Uh,
Yeah.
cool. Well, thank you so much, Alex. I've really enjoyed this. This went by fast.
I know, yeah.
Went by really fast. I've enjoyed this opportunity to get to chat with you, and you're gonna have your brother on your channel now at some point.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, I mean, sorry, I don't want to keep you too long, but
Oh, that's fine.
I think he said he's reading like and during certain lessons because he's teaching English
Ah,
in Uganda for that's kind of his job placement for the Peace Corps. And I think he mentioned to me that for some of the lessons he's been reading to them um C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia.
oh, okay.
Yeah, and so I thought, and they're like elementary school kids and stuff, or that
Right,
kind of age, and
right.
so I find that so interesting, and
How
I
fun.
really plan to when he gets back, I want to ask him all about that whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Cool. Yeah, I would love to see him on your channel sometime. Yeah.
Yeah. See how
Awesome.
similar we look. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much. And everybody, there will, of course, be a link to Alex's channel, Books with Banks, in the description below. Check out some of his wonderful, very thoughtful content. And he's, as we said, some really cool author discussions on there as well. So lots to follow. And thank you so much, Alex. I've really enjoyed this time.
Thank you too. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, such a pleasure. All right, everybody. Until next time.